You were taught to see Nazi Germany as an anomaly, a nation that somehow rebuilt itself through rage, ideology, and mass psychology alone. In that version of history, the war machine appears almost spontaneously, as if hatred could manufacture tanks, aircraft, fuel, and logistics networks by sheer force of will. It is a comforting story because it keeps responsibility contained inside Germany and places moral failures safely in the past. But modern war does not work that way. Large-scale military power is not born from ideology. It is assembled through capital, industrial capacity, and long-term planning. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, Germany was economically crippled. Reparations, obligations, strained state finances, hyperinflation had erased private savings, unemployment remained catastrophic, and the national currency lacked credibility. More importantly, Germany lacked access to oil, strategic raw materials, and the financial reserves required to sustain rearmament. On its own, the country did not possess the inputs necessary to build a modern army, and yet, within a remarkably short period, Germany transformed into a highly mechanized military power capable of sustained continental warfare. This transformation did not originate from political speeches or nationalist enthusiasm. It required steel, fuel, transportation fleets, industrial chemistry, and administrative systems capable of coordinating mass production. None of those emerge in isolation, and none of them appear without funding. To understand how this became possible, the focus must shift away from Berlin and toward the international financial system that shaped Germany's post-war recovery. After the First World War, Germany's economy was not merely stabilized. It was reorganized through external credit structures. American financial institutions played a decisive role in restructuring German debt, managing repayment schedules, and channeling capital under internationally supervised frameworks. These arrangements were not acts of reconstruction driven by goodwill. They were commercial decisions designed to generate returns while exerting influence over a weakened economy. By the time the Nazi regime assumed power, it inherited an economic system already intertwined with foreign capital flows. This dependency did not disappear with the change in government. In many cases, it deepened. From the perspective of international finance, Germany represented not a moral problem, but a market opportunity shaped by scale, urgency, and state-backed demand. Rearmament promised contracts, volume, and predictability, all attractive features in a volatile global economy. Once this context is understood, the rise of the Nazi war machine can no longer be explained as a purely domestic phenomenon. It becomes the product of a broader system in which capital, technology, and industrial cooperation crossed borders far more easily than moral responsibility. And that is where the real story begins. When the focus moves from ideology to finance, the chronology becomes clearer and far less mysterious. Germany did not rebuild in a vacuum. It was rebuilt inside an international credit system that treated the country less as a defeated aggressor and more as a distressed but exploitable borrower. The mechanism was not hidden. It operated openly through debt restructuring, bond markets, and banking supervision, all framed as stabilization but structured around profit and leverage. In the mid-1920s, Germany's economic survival was tied to external capital. Reparations payments were politically mandated, but the funds to meet them came largely from foreign loans. American banks were central to this process. Through coordinated lending programs, German debt was refinanced, currency pressures were eased, and capital was injected into industry. The result was not independence, but dependency. Germany could function as long as credit flowed, and that credit was largely priced, managed, and recycled through American financial institutions. This arrangement created a circular system. American banks lent to Germany. Germany used that money to service reparations. Those payments flowed to Allied governments, which then used portions of the funds to repay their own debts to American lenders. On paper, everyone was meeting obligations. In reality, the entire structure depended on continuous lending from the same source. When that lending paused during the global financial shock at the end of the decade, the system collapsed, taking German employment, political stability, and democratic legitimacy with it. By the time the Nazi regime took power, the groundwork had already been laid. The state inherited not only economic crisis, but a financial architecture that could be redirected. Rearmament did not begin with domestic savings or taxation. It began with access to credit, deferred payments, and foreign-linked industrial financing that could be quietly repurposed. From the perspective of lenders and investors, the change in regime did not automatically invalidate prior arrangements. Contracts remained contracts. Bonds remained bonds. Political transformation did not erase financial opportunity. What mattered most to Wall Street was not the ideology of the borrower, but the scale and certainty of demand. A government committed to rapid reindustrialization offered exactly that. Military buildup meant long-term procurement, infrastructure investment, and guaranteed state backing. For financiers accustomed to volatile markets, this kind of demand looked stable, even attractive. Risk was not eliminated, but it was quantified, priced, and accepted. This is the point where the moral narrative usually intervenes, suggesting that warning signs should have stopped the flow of money. But markets do not respond to warning signs. They respond to incentives. As long as lending remained legal and profitable, the system continued. The financial world did not see itself as creating a war machine. It saw itself as managing exposure while extracting returns. By the late 1930s, Germany's rearmament was no longer a secret. It was observable, measurable, and discussed. Yet the financial channels that had enabled recovery were not fully dismantled. They were adapted. The result was a regime that could mobilize industry at scale while remaining partially integrated into the global financial order. Understanding this does not require conspiracy. It requires accepting that modern finance can remain operational even as the political consequences of its decisions become catastrophic. Wall Street did not need to endorse Nazism to make it viable. It only needed to keep the capital moving. Once capital was available, the next constraint was capability. Money alone does not produce a war machine. It must be converted into fuel, materials, transportation, and coordination at an industrial scale. This is where the story shifts from banks to corporations, from balance sheets to patents, processes, and production systems that Germany did not possess on its own. In the early 1930s, Germany faced a structural problem that no amount of nationalism could solve. It lacked oil. It lacked access to overseas colonies. It lacked secure supply lines for rubber, fuel, and key industrial inputs. Any prolonged military campaign would stall almost immediately without substitutes. The solution was not ideological, it was technological, and it arrived through corporate partnerships that treated know-how as a tradable asset rather than a strategic liability. American firms occupied a central position in this transfer. Through joint ventures, licensing agreements, and patent sharing, critical technologies moved across borders under the cover of normal business practice. Synthetic fuel production, chemical processing, and advanced industrial methods allowed Germany to compensate for its material shortages. These were not improvised solutions. They were the result of deliberate cooperation, negotiated contracts, and long-term planning between corporate entities that understood the value of proprietary technology. At the same time, modern war required administration on a scale never seen before. Mobilizing millions of soldiers, managing logistics across continents, and coordinating industrial output demanded information systems capable of tracking people, resources, and schedules with mechanical precision. Data processing, classification, and tabulation became as essential as steel and fuel. These systems did not emerge organically from the Nazi state. They were adapted from existing commercial technologies, designed to manage complexity in large organizations. What makes this stage of the story particularly disturbing is how ordinary it appeared at the time. Executives did not frame their decisions as contributions to conquest or mass violence. They framed them as market expansion, technology licensing, and competitive positioning. Subsidiaries were treated as semi-autonomous units. Revenue streams were tracked independently of political outcomes. As long as contracts were honored and payments continued, operations were considered successful. Even after war began in Europe, production did not immediately stop. Corporate structures were flexible enough to continue functioning under new conditions, often justified by legal separation or local control. The same systems that insulated companies from financial risk also insulated them from moral responsibility. Distance was not an accident. It was a design feature. By the time German forces moved across Europe with speed and coordination, the underlying industrial system was already in place. Trucks, fuel, communications equipment, and administrative tools did not appear suddenly. They were the outputs of years of preparation embedded in international corporate relationships. The war machine did not simply mobilize German society. It mobilized a network of global expertise that had been assembled long before the first invasion. At this point, the question is no longer whether American corporations directly intended the outcomes that followed. The more important question is whether intent mattered at all in a system where profit, legality, and operational continuity were sufficient to keep the machinery running. When the war finally began, this was the moment when theory should have met consequence. Germany invaded Poland. Europe was dragged into open conflict. Lines were drawn, alliances activated, and moral positions publicly declared. In the political imagination, this is where cooperation ends and opposition begins. But in the economic system that had already been built, the transition from peace to war was not a clean break. It was an adjustment. For large corporations and financial institutions, war did not automatically mean disengagement. It meant reassessment. Contracts were reviewed. Legal exposure was recalculated. Operations were reclassified. The central question was not whether the war itself invalidated previous relationships, but whether those relationships could be maintained under new conditions without triggering unacceptable risk. As long as a pathway existed through subsidiaries, neutral intermediaries, or occupied territories, the machinery continued to operate. This is where the structure of multinational enterprise reveals its true function. Subsidiaries provided insulation. Licensing agreements provided continuity. Geographic distance provided deniability. A factory producing military equipment in Germany could be described as locally controlled, even if ownership and strategic direction remained elsewhere. A bank branch operating under occupation could be framed as complying with local law, even if its actions directly supported expropriation and asset transfer. Each layer added legal clarity while dissolving moral accountability. What made this possible was the normalization of separation between ownership and consequence. Decision-makers did not need to approve every output. They only needed to maintain the system that allowed output to occur. Trucks rolled off assembly lines. Fuel was refined. Communications equipment functioned. Administrative systems processed data. Each component appeared technical, neutral, and necessary. Taken together, they formed a war machine that could sustain itself even as the human cost escalated. The logic was reinforced by wartime uncertainty. Executives argued that intervention might endanger assets permanently. Banks claimed that withdrawal could lead to total loss. Companies insisted that maintaining operations preserved leverage for the future. These arguments were not irrational within the framework of corporate finance. They were consistent with a worldview in which capital preservation outranks ethical rupture. And so, even as American soldiers eventually entered the war, parts of the economic network that had enabled German rearmament remained intact longer than public memory suggests. The system did not ask whether it should stop. It asked whether it could afford to. That distinction explains far more than ideology ever could. By the time the outcome of the war became inevitable, the economic damage had already been internalized as a cost of doing business. Factories destroyed by bombing were recorded as losses. Assets seized were written down. Claims were prepared. The same legal frameworks that had protected operations during the war now positioned companies to seek compensation afterward. This is the point where the story turns from collaboration to consequence, and where the gap between moral expectation and economic reality becomes impossible to ignore. When the war ended, the moral script seemed straightforward. The camps were liberated. The scale of destruction was undeniable. Industrialized murder had been documented in records, factories, and administrative systems that left little room for denial. If there was ever a moment when accountability should have reached beyond uniforms and into boardrooms, this was it. For a brief period, that possibility existed. The post-war trials acknowledged a truth modern societies had rarely confronted before, that mass violence requires organization, and organization requires industry. Executives from German conglomerates were prosecuted for their roles in forced labor, plunder, and military production. The legal principle was clear. Economic power could not be separated from political crime. But the boundary of that principle stopped at nationality. American corporations did not face the same scrutiny, not because evidence was absent, but because priorities shifted. Europe needed rebuilding. The emerging Cold War reframed the global order almost immediately. Industrial capacity became strategic. Manufacturing, technology, and finance were no longer suspects, they were assets. The same companies that had quietly benefited from wartime production were now essential to reconstruction, stabilization, and containment. This recalibration transformed accountability into inconvenience. Investigations narrowed, files were classified. Responsibility was reframed as complexity. Corporate involvement was reduced to technical cooperation, unfortunate entanglement, or unavoidable continuity. Where moral failure might have demanded punishment, strategic necessity demanded silence. The legal system adapted accordingly. Instead of criminal trials, there were claims, processes. Instead of culpability, there were compensation requests. Bombed factories were treated as damaged property rather than components of a war economy. Companies that had profited from forced labor or military contracts positioned themselves as victims of conflict rather than participants in it. Courts accepted the framing because it fit the moment. Stability mattered more than reckoning. Decades later, when lawsuits resurfaced and archives opened under public pressure, the outcomes reflected the same logic. Settlements were negotiated without admissions of guilt. Funds were created that sounded substantial until measured against wartime profits and post-war growth. Payments were delayed long enough that many victims never lived to see them. The process satisfied legal closure without disturbing institutional continuity. What emerged from this period was not justice, but a lesson. Time dilutes responsibility. Complexity shields power. And if an institution can survive the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, it can often negotiate the terms under which it will be remembered. This was not an accident of history. It was a structural outcome of an economic system that treats accountability as a variable rather than a constant. The war ended. The system did not change. It adjusted. By the time the post-war settlements were finalized and public attention drifted elsewhere, a deeper transformation had already taken place. The lesson absorbed by corporate power was not that collaboration with violent regimes carried lasting consequences. It was the opposite. If exposure could be delayed, fragmented, and reframed, responsibility could be managed. And once responsibility becomes manageable, it stops being a deterrent. The global economy that emerged after the war was built to institutionalize that lesson. Multinational corporations expanded across borders, not only to reach new markets, but to distribute risk. Ownership structures grew more complex. Supply chains stretched across jurisdictions with different labor laws, enforcement standards, and political incentives. Each additional layer created distance between decision-makers and outcomes. When harm occurred, it could be assigned to a contractor, a subsidiary, or a local partner operating under different conditions. Is last to bend. This is not a moral failure unique to any era. It is a structural feature. Corporate systems are designed to optimize efficiency, continuity, and return on investment. They are not designed to internalize human cost unless regulation forces them to do so. Absent that pressure, the logic defaults to what it has always been. Maintain access, protect assets, preserve optionality. What makes this continuity uncomfortable is how familiar the justifications sound. In the 1930s, executives argued that they could not control foreign subsidiaries. In the present, companies argue that supply chains are too complex to fully audit. Then, cooperation was framed as neutrality. Now, it is framed as engagement. Different vocabulary, same function. The language changes to suit the era, but the underlying calculation remains intact. Consumers play an indirect but crucial role in sustaining this pattern. Modern markets reward low prices, rapid innovation, and constant availability. Those rewards transmit pressure upstream, encouraging cost minimization and flexibility at every stage of production. When that pressure intersects with authoritarian governance or weak labor protections, exploitation becomes a feature rather than a deviation. As long as demand remains strong, corporate behavior receives confirmation rather than correction. This is why historical comparisons provoke discomfort. They collapse the distance between past and present. They suggest that the mechanisms enabling atrocity are not aberrations locked in a darker century, but recurring outcomes of systems that prioritize profit while externalizing consequence. The individuals change. The regimes change. The incentives do not. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires clarity. The machinery that once helped enable one of history's greatest crimes did not disappear when the war ended. It evolved, scaled, and integrated itself more deeply into everyday economic life. And because it operates through contracts, logistics, and legal structures rather than overt ideology, it often goes unnoticed. By the time these patterns are recognized, they are already normalized. That is why the final question is not whether history repeats itself, but why the conditions for repetition remain so reliably in place. If there is one illusion this story destroys completely, it is the idea that history naturally corrects itself. It does not. Systems do not become moral with time, they become efficient. And efficiency, when detached from accountability, is not progress. It is refinement. What the reconstruction of Nazi Germany's war machine reveals is not a secret cabal or a singular betrayal. It reveals something far more dangerous, a repeatable formula. Capital flows toward opportunity. Technology moves where it is rewarded. Institutions protect continuity over consequence. When these forces align, atrocities do not need fanatics at the top. They only need administrators willing to keep the system running. This is why the story cannot end in 1945. The war closed, but the logic survived intact. Corporations learned that reputation could be repaired, but balance sheets could not be surrendered. Governments learned that industrial power was too valuable to alienate. Consumers learned to enjoy the benefits of global production without tracing its origins too closely. Together, these lessons formed the operating system of the modern economy. The most uncomfortable realization is also the most important one. No company involved in this story believed it would be remembered as complicit. Each acted within legal frameworks, market norms, and accepted practices of its time. That is precisely the problem. When legality becomes the ceiling of responsibility, morality becomes optional. And when morality is optional, it is always the first cost to be cut. This is why never again is not a promise. It is a warning that requires maintenance. Without transparency, enforcement, and public pressure, the incentives that once enabled catastrophe remain fully functional. They simply attach themselves to new markets, new regimes, and new justifications. The Nazi war machine was not an isolated historical anomaly. It was a demonstration of what happens when financial power, industrial capability, and political violence intersect without restraint. The names have changed. The structures have evolved. But the question remains exactly the same as it was then. Who benefits, who pays, and who is allowed to look away? If this made you uncomfortable, it should have. Because discomfort is the first signal that a story you were given was incomplete. And incomplete stories are how systems like this survive. Like the video if you're done with the sanitized version of economic history. Share it if you think these mechanisms deserve daylight. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling on threads most people would rather leave buried. And tell me in the comments which modern industry you think is repeating this pattern right now.